Hello, I'm Chris Canham. I work at the Centre for Digital Music here on the SoundSoftware project. And I know that Mark obviously has introduced the project earlier. CPSLC funded for your project, which is intended, although we run the project here at the Centre for Digital Music, it's very much intended to serve the whole UK audio and music research community. And the idea is to identify and do whatever we can to support sustainable development and reuse of software and data in order to try and achieve better research. Excuse me. Now, obviously, the core of the problem here is that research has become more complex over the years and has become more integrated between the paper publication and software and data that's used to generate the results. There may have been a time when it was possible to publish a single paper in which you could include all the information necessary to reproduce the results. That certainly isn't possible now. So, in response to this, the idea of reproducible research was invented, in which you have the paper, the software, and the data, and you publish them all in various open ways, and they get pulled together in a sort of single bundle that everyone can use to reproduce the software, to reproduce the results. This is not often done in our community, and we wondered why not. We carried out a survey in late 2010, early 2011, of researchers in our field. We had, I think, 54 complete and 23 partial answers. And we found that of the people who responded, 82%, that's the blue lot, said that they developed code during their research. Of those, again, the blue segment, 39% said that they took some steps towards reproducibility of their work. So that might mean, as well as publishing code, it might mean using standard data sets that other people had available so that they could carry out the same work. Or it might mean documenting their code and data so that future researchers in their own group would be able to carry out the same work or build on the same work. So it's covered a variety of different activities, different positive activities. Of that group, 35%, which is 11% of the whole, said that they published some software. So, of the people who responded to our survey, 11% reported having actually published some code at some point. Now that's perhaps actually slightly better than I might have expected, but there's obviously a lot of room for improvement. The situation is similar, possibly worse in other fields. This is quite a nice result from a few years ago in economics, where this chap looked at an economics journal which has or had a data and code archiving policy, and the policy here was not editorially supervised. It had just been introduced. The idea was supposed to be that after your paper was submitted, was accepted rather, you would bundle up your code and data, supporting code and data, and put it in the journal's archive. And he looked at 11 articles which had been published after the policy had appeared. Of those, 9 were empirical articles that should have had some supporting code and data. From those, he found that 7 of the entries in the journal archive were completely empty. He contacted the authors. I think one of them responded in a fairly positive way, but only to say that he lost the original data. He was able to reconstruct or produce a similar set and provide it, but it wasn't the same set. One of them actually responded that the data was confidential, which implies that it probably shouldn't have been published in the first place. Of the remaining 2, they had code. In one case, the code had an error and it wouldn't run. In the other case, the code was compiled MATLAB code that couldn't be examined or modified, and that didn't produce the same results as in the paper. So none of these could be replicated without the help of the original authors. So why don't we generally publish code and data? We asked people in our survey why they me what factors they found were obstacles. And the most common replies we got were lack of time, copyright restrictions on the data, and some feeling generally that we may be able to make some commercial use of this in future. I don't know how often that actually turned into real commercial use. I suspect not terribly often. A study by the UK's Research Information Network in 2010 found also that people didn't necessarily think it was worth it. They had this sort of feeling that they were in competition with other scientists and they didn't want other people to build on their work and do a better or more novel things before they had. And concerns that the code wasn't good enough because they were self-taught. Also, there's this problem that you need to think about it at the start. It's quite difficult to take a paper that you're preparing for publication and at the same time make the code and data, review it, work out whether it's really appropriate for publication, whether it's good enough, sort out all final problems and actually get it out there. There are probably also some reasons that we don't necessarily want to talk about. With this paper, we only really need the title, which is Willingness to Share Research Data is Related to the Strength of the Evidence and the Quality of Reporting of Statistical Results. This is from psychology field. And here they looked at, I think, 49 papers and found that there was generally a correlation between the willingness of the authors to provide you with their data when asked afterwards and the lack of errors in the reporting. So the authors who didn't like to provide the data were more likely to have made a mistake in the statistical analysis in the paper. Now, does this maybe cut both ways? When you're preparing a paper for publication, obviously you're anticipating peer review, and that makes you look more closely at what it is you're writing and do your own review of your own work. Is it possible that by approaching code and data with the perspective that you will need to share it at some point, we can also make ourselves more inclined to do, to take the necessary steps to ensure that the quality of the code and the results based on the data are actually up to scratch. Anyway, the suggestion is partly suggested by the earlier result I mentioned, in which a paper that had a policy was still getting people submitting or failing to submit any code and data. The suggestion that a top-down approach wouldn't necessarily work, that just suggesting what people should do and trying to create a policy about it is perhaps not the whole of the answer. What we need to do is try to solve the problems that researchers have in front of them at the time they're actually doing the research, that will then lead to their being unable or unwilling to publish code later on. So we want to try and identify some of the specific barriers that people have for publication and see if we can find ways to nudge people over those barriers so as to increase this perception that the code is something you can work on collaboratively, you can reuse, you can share, and try and prepare the ground that way for more natural sort of movement towards reproducible publication. So these are the barriers that we identified. These are specifically barriers to the publication of code rather than data. We have got a pilot data management project going on that has been going on in the Centre for Digital Music as well, and Steve Wellburn will be talking about that this afternoon. But these are specifically about code. The first one was lack of confidence. Researchers are generally not trained software developers. They tend to be largely self-trained. The approach that we have been trying to take with this is to get involved with projects like the Software Carpentry project and running workshops and tutorials which try and provide relatively small amounts of training that is specific to the needs of researchers. So by and large, even simple things like how you organize code into different files, or how you write a program so that you have various different modules that can call one another, are apparently disproportionately beneficial, or at least disproportionately well received, in the sense that these are concepts that many people who've just been sat down and had to write their own code from scratch have not really had time to get familiar with in the past. The second barrier is lack of facilities and tools. Researchers generally don't use version control or code hosting facilities. In our survey, we found that 51% of respondents said that their code never left their own computer at all, and 59% said that they didn't use any version control system. We've introduced this software project code site, which, unlike most of the existing sites, and obviously there are many very fine ways of managing version controlled data and code and sharing it with other researchers, like using GitHub or SourceForge, Google Code, any of these. Those tend to focus on open source software projects, and they're perhaps a little off-putting for researchers who are more nervous about the idea of how you will work collaboratively on your code. Our code site focuses specifically on audio and music research in the hope that people will feel more part of a community of their peers that they can be comfortable in. It allows both public and private projects, but private projects can be shared with people at other institutions as well, so that you can work collaboratively. And it allows you to link publications, paper publications, with your code in the site, so that you have more of a trail between your citable output and your code. And we've also tried to provide some simplified tools for using this, like, for example, the Easy Mercurial user interface for the Mercurial version control system that we use on this site. That's a picture of the site and the Easy Mercurial user interface. So far, these are the number of people and number of projects that have been using the site. There's nearly 300 projects from, I think, about 130 users, of whom about half at the moment are people who are working at Queen Mary, or have been in the past working at Queen Mary and have left. So we'd like to expand this more around other institutions as well. The next barrier is that there's not necessarily much of a clear incentive for publishing software. It's not. I mean, I think it is possible to include a software program as an accessible research output, for example, for the Research Excellence Framework, I think. But simply having software published as part of your paper publication trail, it's not clear that that really helps your assessed research output. It is probably likely that it will improve your citations, but is it enough to make it worthwhile? And our hope here is that by having a link between paper publications and software projects on the site, we will enable people to think of code as more of a thing that you can cite as well as a separate output itself. And the final barrier, which is one of the most difficult ones, is that the people in this field tend to use a lot of different platforms and development tools and frameworks. And the responses to our survey, we had people using C, C++, Objective-C, Clojure, Java, Python. We've got people in this group using Prolog. We've got all sorts of stuff, MaxMSP, and MATLAB, of course, and lots of MATLAB toolboxes. And these are not only very varied, and some of them are more platforms that are more inclined to decay than others. For example, if you're writing C for a particular platform, it isn't necessarily going to continue to work on other platforms in the future. Our recommendation there is to try to take advantage of environments in which you can develop plugins or modules for an existing system. So, for example, for a lot of our output, we have the VAMP plugins, which are audio analysis plugins, which can be used in Sonic Visualizer. And similarly, things like externals for MaxMSP or Pure Data. Ways in which code can be developed and published in a way that people who are not necessarily involved with the initial development have some sort of incentive to continue maintaining and using it. By tagging along with a widely used ecosystem, we think that we can improve the likelihood that your code is maintained in the future. So that gives us 4 suggestions for research groups generally. One is to aim at easy training targets and try and integrate some of the very basic software development training into the way that researchers are brought into the department, or to try and to get people going on things like software carpentry courses. Second is to insist on use of version control. For example, in sharing code between people within the group. The third one is to try, wherever possible, to turn code into plugins or modules for existing systems. And finally, to encourage collaborative development, to try and get people to think about working together on code in the same way that you might work together on papers. And here are some links, and the slides are up there, and there are various notes on the slides that contain a bit more information as well. And that's all I have to say. Any questions?
So I know, Chris, you're sort of fighting against the throat difficulty at the moment, but I'm sure we'll be able to take a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So, any questions?
Yeah. So I'm in Copenhagen, and I'm not in any way financially supporting Queenberry, for instance, but I can use the software and host my code and develop it.
Yeah.
Or is it only within?
Well, the original purpose of the code site was to be a site for UK audio music researchers and people working with them. So anyone working on a project, anyone not in the UK but who was working on a project with a UK researcher. And anybody can register, but you have to include a little description of what you're doing when you register. And the admins look at that and say, okay, good. We've had a lot of inquiries from people who would like to be using the site, but don't have that sort of connection with UK researchers. And I think maybe in terms of policy we need to be a little more flexible in future.
Yeah, so currently we're working up a policy for this. We'd originally intended it to be for the UK.
Essentially, I think we're about to revise it a bit.
So the policy is likely to be that if we could push at the other angle for this, that is to the benefit to UK audio music researchers, which is where our funding comes from. If somebody's developing software that's likely to be of benefit to the UK community, which means everybody essentially, then, as in not UK is everybody, but if it's a benefit to UK researchers, it's likely to be a benefit to other people worldwide, then therefore that will also be something that we'd like to encourage as well. But we didn't want to make it just open sort of to everything to start with, because we're sort of trying to control how we're going to start with so we can understand how it works. But I think we'll probably be asking for people to say, write us a paragraph to say why you think UK or worldwide researchers would benefit from your software, and then we'll take it from there. Question over here.
Can you give me a brief idea of how one would go about querying your site for a particular type of software that I was looking for?
Well, it's got a search box and projects can be tagged, but you have trouble if people haven't tagged their projects. I mean, it's like any sort of repository in that you do have to rely rather on the people who put the project in there to maintain the metadata a bit. Is there a particular type of software?
Say I wanted an adaptive tracking, program for psychophysics, some certain type of stimulus.
In terms of categorization, not really. You'd have to hope that somebody has, that the people who put the projects out tagged it in such a way as to say, tracking psycho, whatever. Ideally, it would be good to be able to go through the trail of who has worked on something and see what other groups they've worked with, where they come from, and so on. And that information is exposed, but there probably isn't enough of a network in there to make it a useful way of querying the site at the moment. Perhaps that's the sort of thing we might be able to improve as the site grows.
What's the demand been like for training, and can you meet it so far for the software carpentry?
Well, software carpentry is a very loosely organised thing. It was set up by Greg Wilson, who Cameron mentioned a moment ago, where the goal is not only to be able to train research students, but also to train research students to provide the training. So, in principle, as you do more training, the pool of available trainers should increase as well. We found, though, that certainly in the software carpentry workshops that we've organised with the Software Sustainability Institute this year, the demand in the UK has been very high. And we're trying for the next. I think we're hoping to have a workshop specific to audio and music around graphics.
Yes. So we're working on dates for that.
But I think we want to do put in a bit more work in trying to get things specific to this field, because some of the training that we've done so far this year has been more general.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm aware we're running a little bit behind, so maybe if I can ask to take more questions over lunch, then we'll do that. And Chris, I think there'll be a demonstration of this towards the end of lunch. Is that
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
In here.
So if you can make an announcement of that before, great, we'll do that. Okay, thanks very much again, Chris.